Hi. Now, the next question is going to come from the topic family values and religion in the public square. Family values. And the first one is going to Mr. Carroll from Mr. David Pawlowski. Mr. Carroll, what is your position on religious liberty and the First Amendment prohibitions on the establishment of a national church/denomination? Can the state ever compel someone to go against their beliefs in favor of promoting the common good?
Okay, I'm a little unclear. Partly I have pictures of people blocking what I can read here. But we do not have in our country an official church or denomination, but that does not mean that we don't have freedom of religion. People should not be forced to go. For instance, nurses should not be forced to take part in abortions. And if you have any kind of religious belief that would prevent you from doing something like that, the government shouldn't be able to compel you to do that. That's a long tradition in our country. If you don't believe in going to war, we have alternative services, we have other kinds of things. Our country has never had a tradition of forcing people to go against their religious belief.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Carroll.
All right. So it looks like we do have a rebuttal from Mr. Schriner.
Yep. Please, Mr. Schriner, your rebuttal.
Very good. Yeah, it's not actually a rebuttal, but it's an addendum to what Brian was talking about. The ASP calls for, we oppose strains of aggressive secularism that seek to remove all traces of religious identity from the public sphere. Now, at that conference last weekend, there was a talk specifically, actually by Brennan Baker, and it was just absolutely excellent. They're experiencing a problem down in Dover, Ohio right now, and they're talking about removing these crosses. And it's my belief, and as president, we would strongly, robustly back the First Amendment when it comes to religious liberty, just in general. And what Brian was talking about with conscience clauses, when we were in Colorado, we interviewed a woman who was a pharmacist who actually quit her job because she was being forced to sell contraceptives and abortifacients through the pharmacy there.
All right.
And so she made.
Mr. Schriner, I'll allow you 5 more seconds, but your time is pretty much up.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Apologize. We have to move on to the next question. The next question is from Mr. Perkins. How would you, Mr. Perkins, this is from Mr. Antenna, how will you evaluate D.K. Chesterton's claim that any reasonable pagan, if he were worked out, would discover that the family existed before the state and has prior rights, that the state exists only as a collection of families, and that its sole function with regard to families is to safeguard the rights of each and all of them?
Well, I think generally that statement. I mean, obviously, the family comes before the state. You know, story from the Bible, Adam and Eve, have their children, and that's where society comes from. And even if we look at it from a non-religious perspective, before there was any society with a larger government over it, there were always families. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been human beings. That's where the generation of people comes from. So I think that there is definitely something to that families are the basis of the state, the fundamental unit of the state, and that the only part that I would have to consider more is the last section where it says its sole function with regard to them is to safeguard the rights of each and all of them. And I think that's true as far as it goes, but it does of course get complicated, where rights and responsibilities intersect, and so where a right can imply corresponding duty. And so it can also, by safeguarding rights, compel certain actions. Taxation is the most obvious one, I think, in order for the common good. So I think overall, I would agree with this statement, this claim. Just make sure that we're not oversimplifying it, and we're also considering the duties that arise from rights.
All right, thank you, Mr. Perkins. And Ray, I think there is some disconnect coming from your end in terms of sound. So if you don't mind, I'll take over for the moderating from here. All right. So does anyone have any rebuttals or addendums to that? All right. The floor recognizes Mr. Brian Carroll. Mr. Carroll, you have the floor. Your 1 minute begins now.
I'll just say that there's a constant tension over the question of who has primary responsibility, ownership or stewardship, or whatever you want to call it, over children. And the government will always want to say that it's primarily theirs, that the kids belong to the state. And as a party, I think the Solidarity Party says no. The primary responsibility for kids is the parents.
All right, thank you, Mr. Carroll. And now we'll move on to our next question. Our third and last question for religion and in the public square is to Mr. Joe Schriner. Mr. Schriner, Americans today have no idea what separation of church and state means in terms of the U.S. Constitution. Many Americans see my Catholic Christian values as being hate-based and bigoted. However, they completely overlook the values held by other, more orthodox members of our society who flourish freely in this country. How would you, as president, protect me, as well as the Amish, the Hasidic community, the more conservative members of Islam, and other groups that are not forced to participate in anything that flies in the face of our religious principles? This is a question from Ms. Leslie Klinger. Mr. Schriner, you have 2 minutes to respond, and your time begins now.
Well, Leslie, that's a long one. I guess I drive the electric vehicle out to California and form a perimeter around your house when you're saying the rosary. As far as this goes, number one, the first part about separation of church and state, I mean, settlers came over here, they were trying to get away from England because they didn't want to be controlled by the state, which was colluded with the church. And so they came over here to try to find freedom of religion. And that's all that basically means. And so when people use that as a dodge in order to say, well, you can't do this practice, you can't do that practice out in the public square, that's just a bunch of hooey, so to speak. And so as I talked about in an earlier question, I, as president, would strongly, really robustly back First Amendment freedom of religion for any group practicing their religious principles. And so on top of that, as president, because I happen to be Catholic, I would be practicing my religion. And not only would I be practicing it in the public square, but I would let that spirituality inform the decisions that I was making. Much the same as the ASP platform, as I talked about in the opening statement, is informed by spirituality as well. And so instead of being defensive, I think that us of faith need to be extremely proactive and offensive as far as our displays of faith out in the public. Because if that doesn't happen, there's a movie called For the Greater Glory about what happened down in Mexico about 100 years ago when people started to back up and become afraid to speak up for their faith. So that's, Leslie, what I would do kind of in a cliff note.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schriner. Do we have any rebuttals or addendums? Floor recognizes Mr. Perkins. Mr. Perkins, you have 1 minute to respond. That time begins now.
Well, I certainly agree with the principles of religious liberty and religious freedom. I do think that we do need to consider that it's not absolutely unlimited. If we look back at the period of segregation and Jim Crow, there was a relatively strong movement, especially in Southern Protestantism, to argue that segregation or the subjugation even of Black people was a religious principle, was taught by the Bible, And so to practice segregation was mandated by God. Now, we, of course, nowadays see that that was very flawed interpretation of the Bible and wrong, but I think that we need to recognize that there are certain religious principles that may be held that we may have to require people to set aside because of problems with because they conflict with the public good, as we did with the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. So we'll be moving on with our program now.